Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. I'm doing great, thank you very much, and I'm so delighted you've joined me for a fabulous story tonight. But before we get started, go and get yourself something lovely to drink, because I want you to be able to relax and sit back and listen to the story. So let's get started, but before we do, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's get started with tonight's story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners. Candy Seacourt got out of bed. Her eyes squinted as prisms of sunlight danced on the floor of her childhood bedroom, while the blue and white taffeta curtains swung backwards and forwards as a cool breeze teased the fabric into a plethora of crinkly shapes. She was glad that her bedroom had not changed at all in the last 5 years, and that her parents had left everything just as it was, for it made her feel that perhaps she hadn't been away for so very long after all, when, if the truth be told, those 5 years of her unjust incarceration had dragged along at an agonizingly slow pace, rather like a never-ending school year that stubbornly refuses to embrace the Christmas holidays. It had certainly felt like a lifetime for her, being in prison, where the colourless daily protocol of prison life had been as dreary and unexciting as watching paint dry. There had been times when Candy had felt extremely discouraged, as if there'd never be an end to the humiliating body searches, open showers where modesty was a luxury that simply didn't exist, along with the sloppy, tasteless, insipid, unpalatable meals that would have made a dog turn up its nose in disgust. She had felt desperately sorry for some of the inmates in prison, some who had no hope of ever acquiring their freedom, as if it had been extracted from their lives like a set of wisdom teeth. She felt bad on her last day in prison, saying goodbye to the other inmates, who had got to know her over the last 5 years, many who were sorry to see her go, and the sadness in their eyes had been tangible. She had noticed the wary, almost resigned eyes of the inmates that would never get to leave this prison, including a woman called Shelley, who'd killed her husband when she'd caught him in bed with another woman, where in an impulsive moment of unbridled rage she had taken his rifle and shot him in the head, so that he died on the spot, leaving the terrified woman he'd been sleeping with to run for her life from the property, begging Shelley not to shoot her. There were stories like this all around the prison, where one moment of sheer stupidity, where common sense had failed to be employed, had cost many of these inmates everything, including their dignity. Shelley had put her arms around Candy and said, "I'll miss you, Candy. You didn't deserve to go to prison, for you did nothing wrong, but I deserve to be here. There isn't a day that goes by that I don't regret what I did. Say hello to the outside world for me, will you? And tell the people out there that freedom is the most precious thing in their lives, and not ever to be tempted to do anything foolish that might cost them everything. Tell them it's not worth it." Another inmate in prison, called Eleanor Taxman, also gave Candy a big, all-embracing hug. "Please tell people about me, that I'm a regular person from an ordinary background with no police record, that is in prison for over 15 years because of drinking and driving. I never believed I'd end up in a place like this, but it can happen to anyone. So warn these people. Don't let them allow one night of drinking to cost them so very dearly that they end up, like me, paying 15 years for a moment of stupidity. I'm here because I thought I could drive home safely one night after a few drinks in a bar, and in my drunken stupor I caused a fatal car accident and killed another driver. Don't worry," Candy assured her well-wishers. "I'll tell people about prison and warn them not to do anything that could potentially rob them of their freedom." "You do that," said Eleanor. "Warn people that it's easier than they think to end up in a dingy, oppressive place such as this. I'm never going to get those 15 years back again, am I?" she said sadly. When Candy had left the prison, she had felt like a bird in a cage whose clipped wings had suddenly grown back after they'd been cut back very severely, so once again she'd be able to fly. The drive from the prison to her home was the most wonderful journey home, better than she'd ever imagined, a feeling of returning to the familiarity she had craved after it had been denied from her for so long. The morning had been magnificently beautiful. She'd sat in the front seat of her father's car, soaking up the warm sunshine, with a gratitude and appreciation she'd never actually known before. The radio was playing some classic music as she soaked in the magnificent views that surrounded her. She felt like someone who'd been locked in a dark dungeon for a long time, like a mole that had suddenly come out to see the light. Mr. Seacourt had asked her on numerous occasions during the journey home why his daughter was being so quiet. Candy's answer was always the same. "Am I dreaming, Dad? Am I really out of that soul-destroying dungeon for good? Please tell me this isn't a dream." "But you are out of prison for good, love," said her father, a bright smile erupting on his face, while his pale grey-blue eyes twinkled with the kind of joy you might expect to see on a man who is seeing his baby son or daughter for the very first time after it's just been born. Candy's mother was sitting in the back seat of the car, and had arrived at the prison dressed to the nines in a colourful dress that expressed a joy that was fitting for this very special occasion. Her perfectly made-up face was now badly smudged, with mascara running down her cheeks in a trail of black, for Mrs. Seacourt had not realised she'd blubber so much on having her daughter back home again. She had surreptitiously mopped away tears with a crinkled tissue, and was sniffing a lot in the car, regularly blowing her nose. And much like her daughter, she wasn't saying very much, for there was nothing really much to say, but to drink in this magnificent moment as if it was the most delicious chocolate malt milkshake you'd ever tasted in your entire life. So it was significantly important to savour every flavour, every second. It would seem for Mrs. Seacourt it was all overwhelmingly emotional. She had waited for this day for so very long, but time had been unforgivingly static. Minutes had dragged by so aimlessly. But now her daughter was out of prison. Mrs. Seacourt was finding the journey back home almost surreal, as if she couldn't quite believe this was actually happening in our time-space. Now that this day had finally arrived, like a gift from the heavens, she wasn't sure on how to exactly receive it. Like when you receive a gift at your front door, delivered to you by the postman, that you're rather uncertain about opening. When Candy had walked out of prison a free woman, Mrs. Seacourt had thrown her arms around her daughter effusively, but the screams of joy she was sure would burst out of her throat like the cries of a seagull had not appeared to make an appearance. It was almost as if these treasured moments of having her daughter back in the free world again did not actually feel real, as if she needed to pinch herself over and over again to reassure herself that no, this was not a dream. Candy sat on the passenger side seat next to her father, staring out of the car window, somewhat bemused, her nose smudging the glass pane, as her father's gold SUV smoothly rolled down the asphalt roads. They passed red barns, fields of cows and sheep, meadows full of alpine flowers, orchards of trees that were dripping with fruit, wood groves of tall, lofty trees. Some of them were magnificent. For Candy it was as if the whole world was suddenly welcoming her back home, as if every single blade of grass and every wild flower of the field was giving her a welcome salute. Candy could feel a nostalgic lump developing in the back of her throat, as a surge of intense emotion shot through her body, making her shake involuntarily, like a baby's rattle. It was almost as if this sensory overload was all too much, rather overwhelming perhaps, especially when you become acclimatized and attuned to living in a rather grey colour palette, so that all the beautiful colours her eyes were feasting on now had turned a somewhat overcast painting into an artist's cheerful palette of spectacular colours, colours she wasn't used to seeing every day. All she could say as she stared out longingly at the scenery was that everything was spectacularly beautiful. "I can't believe how green those trees are over there! And look over there at the cows, Mum, grazing in the pasture. They're magnificent, so serene, so very peaceful. Look at the outstanding markings on their bodies. I never realised how uniquely special individual cow markings are. I've always taken their magnificence for granted. But not any more," she said, shaking her head fiercely. "I haven't seen a cow for 5 years. And now I'm observing the details and everything. Things I've just not noticed before. Indeed, Candy's rapturous enthusiasm on the drive back home had been so infectious, for her father, sitting in the driver's seat, just could not stop smiling. By all accounts, the smile on his face was so incredibly large, it was amazing it fit at all, for he really did look like a kid that had stolen all his mother's candy and gotten away with it. That was how happy he was. The familiar scenery that surrounded Candy was like experiencing an all-embracing warm hug from an old friend that you haven't seen in an absolute age. As the Secourts got closer to home, Candy began to make comments like, "Goodness gracious me, I can't believe how those trees over there have grown. Before I was incarcerated they were small. Now they're sizable. It makes me realise how being away for 5 years really is an awfully long period of time." As Candy's father's gold SUV happily rolled down the long country road that Candy knew so well, her heart almost skipped a beat. Then the moment she'd been waiting for at long last arrived, the moment she thought would never come. Candy drew in a deep breath as Mr. Secourt took a familiar left-hand turn in the road, and then there they were, driving down the long driveway towards the Victorian home that Candy had lived in all her life, the place she had always regarded as home, for really there was no place in the world quite like it. The Victorian house stood up proud and tall, with its turret and decorative features on full display, rather like a young woman flaunting herself unabashedly under a blue sky on a magnificent day when even the sunshine had forgotten to be demure. The regal-looking house had been recently painted in a pale pink colour, which was very becoming for it, and Candy did not think she'd ever seen the house look more stunning. Was it because she'd been away for so long that she was beginning to appreciate things that she never really appreciated before? Details that she so often overlooked now appeared to be grabbing her undivided attention. The house she'd loved all her life really looked like something out of a Hans Christian Andersen fairy tale. The windows gleamed as if they'd been polished within an inch of their lives, and the tall, very old oak tree that she'd loved so much as a child and climbed on multiple occasions on the right-hand side of the property was casting its ethereal shadows over the pink walls of the house, making the spectrum of soft, very gentle light all the more magical and enticing. There was a selection of terracotta pots on display on the driveway that were tumbling over with a plethora of pink, white and lilac geraniums. It was ever so pretty. Near the front door was a bunch of hot air balloons in pinks and violets that matched the colour of the house, and inscripted on the balloons were the words, "Welcome home, Candy." The balloons happily bounced in the breeze, almost as if they had an independent life all of their own, and as if they too were excited to see Candy. There was a sign above the front door, painted in pretty colours, which read, "Welcome home, Candy." Candy felt a lump developing in the back of her throat, as an impulsive, involuntary surge of emotion shot through her body like a shooting star. It had got all too much for her, especially when she saw the shadow of the family tortoiseshell cat, Pegasus, sitting in the window, licking his paws contentedly, and stopping for a brief moment to glance out towards the family's gold SUV, almost as if he instinctively knew it contained a very precious cargo that he'd missed very much over the last 5 years. It certainly was not common for Pegasus, who was a somewhat evasive, non-committal cat, to sit in the window like that. It was almost as if Pegasus instinctively knew that she was coming home. She couldn't wait to lovingly wrap her arms around his magnificent silky coat and hear the rumble of his purr in his chest as he rubbed himself against her. Candy could hear the excited barks coming from her father's dog Sheba, and that was when the tears couldn't help themselves any more, for they were like an overflowing riverbank that simply could not be thwarted. They unabashedly spurted out of Candy's eyes, rather like a robust garden hose, and she began to sob, for she had missed Sheba the dog, Pegasus the cat, her mother and dad so very much so that sometimes the pain of being separated from them all had been agonizing for her. She had missed the beautiful home they lived in, the town, so many of her wonderful friends, and realizing how much was all-consuming for her, she was glad to be back home again, to the familiar flavours, sights and sounds that her home embodied, for there was nowhere in the entire world quite like this marvellous place. She was reminded of the saying the family would always say when they returned home from a holiday somewhere: "East is east, west is west, but home is best." "Darling," said her mother, throwing Candy lovingly in her arms when she stepped out of the car, "don't be so upset. Honestly, look at you," she said, looking up at her daughter tenderly and wiping the tears away from her eyes with a tissue. "What are we both like, the two of us?" she said, choking back still more tears that were also spilling down her cheeks. "We're both acting as if we're at a funeral today." "But we're not. You're home. This is a celebration. We don't need to cry any more, do we?" "I know, Mum, but I can't help myself. I can't believe I'm home again. And hearing Shiva bark like that and seeing Pegasus over there in the window, it's reminding me of everything I've missed." "Well, you've got a welcoming party in the house for sure. I think that both Pegasus and Sheba know you're coming home today. They were both behaving very strangely this morning, I have to tell you, as if they sensed something amazing was about to happen. I'm told animals are very instinctive like that, you know. They know when their owners are about to return home from a holiday. It's as if they've almost got some kind of inbuilt tracking system, an inner knowing that we humans don't actually appreciate or understand. Some of the folk in town wanted to organise a special welcome home party for you, but I told them we could have that in a few days' time or so. I think you're going to need to acclimatise to being home first. But just so you know, everybody in town sends you their love, and people can't wait to see you again. Nobody believed you should have spent a minute in that God-forsaken prison." "Oh, I'd forgotten about it," said her mother suddenly. "I left the cardboard box that contains all your stuff on the back seat. I better go and get it. They're the things that were confiscated from you when you first arrived at the prison. And, of course, the box contains a couple of drawings that were given to you by a couple of the inmates that you like so much. I'm sure you're going to want to frame them." As the front door of the house was opened by Mr. Seacourt, in a moment an ebullient Sheba came flying out of the arched doorway, charging enthusiastically towards Candy, tail wagging and legs all over the place, for he couldn't contain his burgeoning excitement. "Sheba, for goodness sake, calm down, will you?" said Candy's mother, in a half-hearted scold, but she couldn't help but laugh. Candy had her arms around Sheba, who was squealing with absolute delight, and then began to dance around the house, as if this was quite possibly the happiest day of his doggy life. Even though he was Mr. Seacourt's dog, a member of the Seacourt family was back home again, and Sheba could not have been more chuffed about this. "Goodness gracious me," said Mrs. Seacourt, wiping away a tear from her eyes. "He's so pleased to see you, isn't he? I can't believe how delighted he is." Moments later, trotting towards Candy was Pegasus, who came straight up to her and began to brush his body against her, purring contentedly. Candy ran her hands through the cat's fur, feeling her heart and her chest filling with so much love. For she had spent many lonely moments in prison, when she had longed to have the cat in her arms, and now here he was. "Pegasus is not playing his usual evasive games today," said Mrs. Seacourt. "He's all over you. Everyone is delighted you're back, darling, including the house, I'm most sure, which has felt so desperately empty without your presence around the place. If houses could skip on their foundations, I'm telling you this house would be doing the tango right now." It would seem the events of the last 24 hours of returning to the comforts of home were still out of focus for Candy, as if she had not quite accepted them as being completely real. Well, not yet. So it would seem, after a really good night's sleep, spent in her old childhood bed, which had been both incredibly comfortable and cosy, when Candy had woken up for a second, it had taken her a while to get used to her bearings. She could feel the heavy lump lying beside her, and realised it was Pegasus the cat, who began to purr the moment she opened her eyes, looking up at her adoringly through his yellow eyes, as if he too was wondering why his human friend had finally come back home again. "Good morning, Pegasus. It's really me, I can assure you it is," she chuckled, running a hand through his fur. "Please tell me, Pegasus. Tell me I'm not dreaming, will you? Are you really lying in my arms like this?" Pegasus responded with a deep pulsating purr in his chest, as if to assure her that yes, she really was not dreaming. Candy stared up at the highly decorative ceiling of the Victorian bedroom, like she'd done throughout her childhood. She couldn't believe she was no longer in prison. It was almost like she needed to pinch herself just to affirm to herself that yes, she was indeed a free woman now. It seemed too good to be true. But she knew she was genuinely home, and there was no better place in the world to be right now, but back in this house, the place she'd grown up in as a girl. For this was the house where most of her most precious memories had been nurtured, and the indelible memories of her childhood were embroiled in the very fabric of this place. For a brief second Candace glanced over towards the collage of photographs on her bedroom wall, depicting pictures of festive occasions spent with both family and friends, moments of time caught up in the flash of a camera and recorded on a piece of card, so they could be relived again and again. Those memories made her smile. Life had been so good back in those days, until it wasn't any more. Candy could hear her mother, Mary Seacourt, singing away happily to herself in the kitchen. It was such a reassuringly comforting sound that she regularly got used to as a girl, especially when her mother was in an upbeat mood, for singing seemed to come naturally to her. Of course her mother was happy today, because her only child was back home again, after an unfortunate 5-year stint spent in prison. Candy could smell the sweet, spicy aroma of cinnamon and crispy bacon on the air, and that delicious mouth-watering smell was making her stomach rumble. She became aware how ravenously hungry she had become. No doubt her mother was cooking up a storm in the kitchen, as she was so delighted to have her daughter back home again, and intended to spoil her rotten. When you've been locked away in prison for about 5 years, the word freedom takes on a whole new meaning for you. And there had indeed been harrowing moments for Candy, when she thought she'd go down for life, but things had turned to her favour, as she'd been accused of involuntary manslaughter, when she absolutely knew that she had not been responsible for what had happened to Larry Quebec all those years ago. But that was now water under the bridge. But if she ever saw Becca Sanchez again, she'd probably wring that girl's neck like a turkey. Becca and her best friend Angie had set her up with their false witness and their burgeoning lies. Indeed, both Becca and Angie's fake testimonies, that were nothing short of farcical, were the quintessential reason why Candy had been incarcerated in the first place. Candy was all too well aware, from bitter experience of course, that sometimes you could be innocent and falsely accused of a crime you never committed. You could be locked away and incarcerated for years and years, for no rhyme or reason, all because the evidence seemed to point against you, proving you to be guilty. The reality that she was free again still hadn't hit home with her. She was certain in any moment there'd be a knock at the door, and the police would be there to cuff her up and take her back to prison again, claiming they'd made a big mistake. So she was nervously living with a profound sense of foreboding that seemed to stick to her rather like a tick on a dog's coat. If the truth be told, it would probably take a while for those irrational feelings like this to shift away, until reality seeped into her consciousness, making her profoundly aware that yes, she was indeed free. When she'd opened her eyes this morning, in her sumptuously cosy bed, with its luxurious Egyptian cotton sheets and very comfortable mattress, she'd expected to feel the familiar scratchy sheets of her extremely uncomfortable prison bunk bed, and to hear the ominous sounds of prison guards and their boots steadily walking up and down the long corridors, jingling their great big bunches of keys. But instead she observed her billowing curtains dancing against the window frame of her bedroom, just like they'd done years before, as Candy loved leaving her windows wide open when the weather was fine. A refreshing cool breeze circulated in her bedroom, bringing in with it the fresh smell of cherry blossom from the tree outside her window. She shivered with delight to realize she really was back home again. And no, this was not a dream. The atmosphere in the house was both calm and serene, as if the morning would chug along happily at its own very contented, leisurely pace, without the regimental structured routines you get in a prison, where your day is mapped out according to set timetables and schedules. Candy rose swiftly to her feet, while Pegasus bounced off the bed, determined to follow her wherever she went, almost as if he was afraid that she'd go away again for an awfully long period of time. Candy slipped her bare feet into her brand new slippers her mother had bought her, and grabbed the fluffy dressing gown her mother had left by her bed. Putting on all these new clothes made her feel extremely pampered and very loved, a feeling in itself that had become quite alien to her, as she was so used to wearing those horrible black and white, very undignified striped prison pyjamas that seemed to rob you of any residual femininity, as if everything that made you an individual there was always expunged from your life. She quickly retreated into the bathroom to wash her face and brush her teeth, with all the brand new luxurious toiletries her mother had kindly left out for her, which made a welcome change from the chalky soap she was used to using in prison, that made all the inmates smell like stale, damp washing. The smell had hung around the prison like the most obnoxious perfume that you had to learn to live with, that was far from pleasant. Once Candy had refreshed herself and put a comb through her long blonde hair, that after 5 years spent in prison had lost its sheen, as the lack of nutrition in the prison food had certainly hijacked her health. But with better food at home, Candy was sure she'd get the shine back in her hair again, and that the unfortunate pimple that had erupted on her chin of late would soon clear up. She trotted down the rather grandiose Victorian staircase and made her eager way into the kitchen on the ground floor, which was a spaciously elegant family room with high Victorian ceilings and vintage cupboards, where her mother Mary, with an apron around her middle, was making dozens of delicious-looking blueberry pancakes that were piping hot and looked temptingly irresistible. Candy had missed Mary Seacourt's cooking, for in prison you certainly did not get good food like this. The kitchen smelt sensational that morning, and Candy's stomach rumbled all the more when she swung open the kitchen door. She couldn't remember the last time she had indulged herself in eating blueberry pancakes for breakfast, drenched with maple syrup and crispy bacon. Mr. Seacourt was sitting at the breakfast nook. He glanced up at Candy when she entered the kitchen, from the newspaper he was reading. Some things never changed, and it was these things that made Candy feel so comforted and reassured. Bill Seacourt was set in his ways, and like many from the baby boomer generation, the thought of reading the news from a laptop was not the way he believed things should be done, for some habits die hard among us, and he was an eccentric in that regard. He enjoyed reading the black and white print of the paper, and the tactile feel of the newspaper in his hands. Candy's parents had retired early, as her father had made enough money in stocks and shares, which had been an extreme blessing for the couple, who had become well-travelled due to the freedom that early retirement had brought them. Bill Seacourt's grey-blue eyes twinkled with enthusiasm to see his 30-year-old daughter standing in their kitchen again, just like old times, her hungry eyes looking towards her mother as she flipped the pancakes at the range like a pro. Mr. Seacourt was delighted to have Candy back home again. Sheba the dog was getting along in years now. He had been about 6 years old when Candy went to prison, and seemed to believe he was joined to Bill Seacourt by the hip, for he would devotingly lie at his master's feet. But on sensing that Candy had entered the kitchen, he promptly bounced to his feet, as if he was still a puppy, and went eagerly charging over to her, his tail wagging profusely. He let out a couple of excited woofs. Ever since Candy had returned home again, Sheba appeared to have forgotten about some of the aches in his back legs, and was behaving as if he was a puppy. Candy, crouching on her knees, embraced Sheba with a warm hug, and a few thumps on the back, which she seemed to really appreciate. "How are you this morning? Oh, what a beautiful dog you are! It's so good to see you again. Oh, I missed you so much." Sheba let out an appreciative bark, while Pegasus, who had followed Candy into the kitchen, was now brushing himself against Candy's legs, as if he wanted to own her. "Look at Sheba! He can't get over the fact you're home again," said Bill Seacourt, looking pleased. "Your coming home has brought the life back into that dog. And look at Pegasus. He's marking you as if to tell everyone you belong to him, and don't touch his property, so to speak. Tell me, Candy, how was it for you last night, sleeping in your old bed again? A little more comfortable, I hope, than the bunk bed in your prison cell." "Oh, Dad, you have absolutely no idea," said Candy, tightening the belt around her dressing gown that had become loose. It was so wonderful, so amazing to sleep in my own bed last night, on such a comfortable mattress, with such fine bed linen and soft pillows. I may as well have been in a grand hotel. Honestly, I don't think I've slept this well for 5 years. And then again, to wake up with Pegasus lying in my arms like old times was amazing, absolutely amazing. It still feels so surreal, Dad, being back home, you know. I keep having to pinch myself over and over again. Half the time I expect to hear a knock at the door and to see the police standing there coming to arrest me and saying that they've made some dreadful mistake and that I've got to go back to prison again. Of course it must feel surreal, Candy dear, to be back home again after 5 years spent in that god-awful place, said her mother, turning around from the range oven, waving a spatula in her hands. Her face was set into a big grin. Her eyes were bright. 5 years may not seem so long, but when you're incarcerated, believe me, every second goes at a very slow pace, and it's agonizingly cruel for all concerned. When life is tough, time tends to stand still, I find, and when life is good, the time seems to fly away to the tune of its own song, she said, placing the final pancake onto the large stack of steaming pancakes piled high with crispy bacon, blueberries and maple syrup, which she laid on the table. I hope you're hungry, love. I made blueberry pancakes especially for you this morning to celebrate your being home with us again. They were always your favourite. Ma'am, they're still my favourite. And with smells like this, I feel as if I've died and gone to heaven, quite literally. I'm starved. You've forgotten for 5 years I've been reduced to eating slop in prison. And they don't exaggerate when they tell you that the food is bad in there, because it is. It's absolutely disgusting. So eating this today, well, you're spoiling me. I really don't deserve all this fuss. But of course you deserve this fuss, love. And I intend to make the most of spoiling you as much as I possibly can to make up for all the Christmases and birthdays you've missed that we never got to enjoy together as a family. While you were away, those were the worst times for me and your father. The house was so desperately lonely without your joyful presence. I'm so glad to have you home, love, said her mother, throwing her arms around her daughter effusively. I worried about you incessantly when you were in prison. I was so concerned about whether you were eating enough, and about how the prison guards were treating you there. I guess I've seen so many unfortunate movies about prison guards treating the inmates very badly, and I hoped you weren't being given too much of a hard time. I also worried about some of the women you were incarcerated with, as I'm sure some of them, well, may have been involved in hideous crimes, and it worried me that you would be befriending some rather unsavoury people. Your mother's not kidding, said Candy's father Bill. Your mother, he said, rolling his eyes. Well, she worried about you all the time. Let's not kid. She never forgave Becca for getting you incarcerated, when you were never guilty of the crime you were accused of in the first place. So there we are. That is the end of part 1 of our story. Part 2 is tomorrow night. I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.